Cranford, New Jersey, June 1935. The diploma felt lighter than Curtis Grubb Culin III expected. He stood on the sun-bleached lawn of Cranford High School, Cap Askew, watching his classmates celebrate around him with a forced enthusiasm that made his chest tighten. They were shouting about futures that didn't exist, making plans for jobs that had vanished 3 years before most of them could spell economics. Curtis adjusted his glasses and tucked the rolled certificate under his arm. General diploma, it said. Nothing special, nothing that would open doors in a country where 25% of the workforce had no doors to knock on. His father waited by the old Ford, engine idling, burning gasoline they could barely afford. Curtis Grubb Culin II worked for Schenley Distillers, one of the lucky ones who'd kept a job when Prohibition ended and the country needed to forget itself at the bottom of a bottle. The elder Culin didn't smile much these days, but there was something like pride in the set of his shoulders as Curtis approached. "Ready?" his father asked. Curtis nodded. Ready for what exactly, he couldn't say. The drive from the school to 215 Holly Street took 4 minutes. 4 minutes through a town that looked like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to change. Storefronts stood empty, their windows reflecting nothing but the ghosts of better times. Men in threadbare suits gathered on corners, smoking hand-rolled cigarettes down to their fingertips, talking in low voices about opportunities that never came. Curtis had grown up watching Cranford slowly suffocate under the weight of the Depression, watching neighbors lose homes, watching families pack everything they owned into automobiles and drive west toward promises that were probably lies. He was 17 years old, and he'd never known America as anything but broken. Holly Street was quiet in the afternoon heat. The Culin house, a modest 2-story with white clapboard siding, stood like a small fortress of stability in a world coming apart. His grandparents lived just down the street at 107, close enough that Curtis could smell his grandmother's cooking on summer evenings when the windows were open. 3 generations of Culins, all pressed together by economic necessity and family loyalty, all trying to maintain dignity when dignity had become a luxury item. Inside, his mother had prepared a small celebration, nothing extravagant. They couldn't afford extravagant, but she'd made his favorite, pot roast with carrots and potatoes, the meat stretched with extra vegetables to make it last. The gramophone in the corner played something optimistic, some crooner insisting that happy days were here again. Curtis didn't believe it, but he appreciated the effort. "To the graduate," his father said, raising a small glass of Schenley's finest. "May you find work in a country that has none to give." It was the most honest toast Curtis had ever heard. The next morning, reality arrived with the alarm clock, 5:30 a.m., and Curtis was expected at Schenley's Manhattan office by 8. His father had pulled strings, called in favors, made promises, done whatever fathers did when their sons needed saving, and secured Curtis a position. Sales promotion assistant. It sounded more impressive than it was. The job consisted of window trimming, computing decorating costs, and general clerking, menial work. Work that required no diploma, no skill, no future. But it was work. And in 1935, work was everything. The commute became Curtis's meditation. Train from Cranford to Newark, transfer to the path, emerge into the organized chaos of Manhattan. He'd watch the city wake up around him. Newsboys hawking headlines about the New Deal, businessmen with hollowed eyes clutching briefcases like life preservers, women in mended stockings heading to jobs that paid just enough to forestall starvation. Curtis learned to read faces on those morning trains. He saw fear wearing a mask of determination. He saw pride fighting a losing battle against desperation. Schenley Industries occupied several floors of an anonymous building where the smell of whiskey permeated even the administrative offices. Curtis's desk was in a windowless room with 3 other assistants, all of them young men grateful to have escaped unemployment. They computed costs on adding machines that clacked like mechanical insects. They designed window displays meant to convince Americans that a bottle of bourbon was the answer to problems that no amount of alcohol could solve. They performed the ritual of commerce in a country where commerce had nearly died. Curtis was good at the work, which depressed him. He had a methodical mind, an eye for detail, a capacity for repetitive tasks that bordered on mechanical. But every evening, riding the train back to Cranford, he felt himself becoming smaller. The work was crushing him one spreadsheet at a time, turning him into exactly what the Depression wanted, a grateful drone, thankful for the opportunity to contribute to someone else's profit while his own dreams withered. He didn't even know what his dreams were anymore. Newark, New Jersey, October 1938. The recruitment poster caught his eye during lunch break. Curtis had walked from the Shenley building to a small diner where coffee was still a nickel, and the waitress knew his name. On the wall beside the phone booth, someone had tacked up a notice. ESX Troop seeks men. The New Jersey National Guard Cavalry unit was recruiting, and the poster showed a soldier on horseback, proud and purposeful, everything Curtis wasn't. He stared at that poster for 3 days before making a decision. The Essex Troop had history. Organized back in 1890 as elite light cavalry, it represented a peculiar kind of American optimism, the belief that citizen soldiers could defend the Republic when called upon, then return to ordinary life when the crisis passed. They trained on horseback, held riding exhibitions, maintained traditions that seemed increasingly quaint in a world of automobiles and airplanes, but they offered something Curtis desperately needed, a sense of purpose beyond window displays and cost computations. On a cold Saturday morning in November, Curtis took the train to Newark and found the armory. It was a fortress of red brick and stone built to withstand siege, a monument to the belief that America would always need warriors. Inside, the air smelled of leather and gun oil and something else, possibility maybe, or at least the illusion of it. The recruiting sergeant was a barrel-chested man named McGrath who looked like he'd been carved from oak and disappointment. He sized up Curtis with eyes that had seen too many soft boys looking for glory. "You ride?" McGrath asked. "No, sir." "You shoot?" "No, sir." "You got any reason I should let you into the finest cavalry unit in the Garden State?" Curtis thought about it. He could have lied, could have inflated his qualifications, could have pretended to be something he wasn't. Instead, he told the truth. "I need to be something other than what I am." McGrath studied him for a long moment. Then he pushed a form across the desk. "Sign here, training starts Monday. Don't be late, and don't expect it to be easy." Curtis signed. His handwriting was neat and precise, the penmanship of a clerk, but something in his chest loosened as he wrote his name. For the first time in 3 years, he felt like he was moving towards something instead of just surviving. The Essex Troop changed him in ways he couldn't articulate. The physical training was brutal, hours in the saddle, learning to ride, to shoot from horseback, to maintain equipment, to function as part of a unit. His body, soft from years behind a desk, hardened. His hands, accustomed to paper and pens, learned the texture of reins and rifle stocks. But the real transformation was internal. In the National Guard, Curtis discovered he had a capacity for practical problem solving that transcended cost computations. When equipment broke, he fixed it. When training exercises went wrong, he improvised solutions. When other soldiers struggled with technical details, he explained them with a patience that surprised everyone, including himself. He was still a clerk at Shenley during the week, still trimming windows and computing costs. But on weekends, he was Guardsman Culin, riding with the Essex Troop, preparing for a war that everyone said would never come. His father didn't understand it. "You've got a good job," the elder Culin said one evening over dinner. "Stable, safe. Why risk it playing soldier?" Curtis didn't have a good answer. How could he explain that stability felt like suffocation, that safety felt like slow death, that he needed to know he was capable of more than surviving? "I'm not playing," was all he managed to say. By 1940, the Essex Troop had mechanized. The horses were retired, replaced by scout cars and motorcycles. The cavalry had evolved into something new, reconnaissance units meant to be the eyes and ears of larger forces. Curtis adapted easily. Machines made sense to him in ways that horses never quite had. He learned to maintain engines, to navigate by map and compass, to coordinate movement over radio. The skills seemed abstract, disconnected from any real purpose, until December 7th, 1941. Curtis was at home that Sunday afternoon when the news crackled over the radio. Pearl Harbor, the Japanese had attacked. The announcer's voice trembled with something between rage and disbelief, and Curtis felt the ground shift beneath him. Everything changed in that moment, not gradually, not with warning, but instantly and irrevocably. The next morning he reported to the armory. So did every other member of the Essex troop. They stood in formation, these citizen soldiers, these clerks and salesmen and mechanics who'd spent years preparing for a war they'd hoped would never arrive. And now it had arrived, and there was nothing to do but step forward into it. On January 6, 1941, the 102nd Cavalry Regiment was inducted into federal service. The ceremony was solemn, almost religious. Men who'd been playing soldier on weekends were now actual soldiers, property of the United States Army, committed to fighting an enemy most of them couldn't find on a map. Curtis stood at attention as they read the orders. His mother was crying. His father stood rigid, pride and fear worn across his face. His grandparents had come too, 3 generations of Culins watching another generation march toward violence. "Forward," the sergeant commanded, and forward they went. The training intensified immediately. The Essex troop was reorganized, redesignated, transformed from a cavalry unit into the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, mechanized. They learned combined arms tactics, learned to work with tanks and infantry, learned to scout enemy positions and report intelligence. They trained in the Carolinas, then shipped to England in the fall of 1943, where the rain never stopped and everyone knew they were preparing for something enormous. Curtis was 29 years old now, ancient by Army standards, where most soldiers were teenagers still trying to figure out how to shave, but age gave him perspective. He'd survived the Depression, survived years of meaningless work, survived the transformation from clerk to soldier. He'd learned the most important lesson the 1930s had to teach. When the world breaks, you improvise or you die. He didn't know it yet, but that lesson would save thousands of lives. England was a steady and controlled chaos. The entire southern coast had become one vast military staging area, every field packed with equipment, every village filled with soldiers, every pub overflowing with men trying to forget that they were about to invade Fortress Europe. Curtis spent his days maintaining vehicles, checking equipment, drilling the same maneuvers until they became muscle memory. At night, he'd lie in his bunk and listen to the bombers flying overhead, heading toward Germany, their engines a mechanical thunder that made sleep impossible. The men of the 102nd knew they were going to France. Everyone knew. The only questions were when and where and how many of them would come back. Curtis wrote letters home, careful censored letters that couldn't mention locations or plans or the fear that made his hands shake when he thought too hard about what was coming. He told his parents he was fine. He told them the English countryside was beautiful, which was true. He told them not to worry, which was a lie. On June 4, 1944, they received the order to move. The invasion was imminent. Curtis and the rest of the 102nd loaded their vehicles onto ships, checked their weapons one final time, and waited. The weather was terrible, wind and rain that made the channel crossing seem suicidal. But Eisenhower had made his decision. They were going. Curtis stood on the deck of the transport ship as England disappeared behind them. The man next to him, a kid from Newark named Patterson, who was barely 18, looked green, seasick before they'd cleared the harbor. "You scared?" Patterson asked. Curtis thought about it, thought about the Depression years, about the meaningless work, about choosing to join the National Guard when he could have stayed safe. Thought about the journey that had brought him from a Cranford High School lawn to the deck of a ship heading toward Nazi-occupied France. "Yeah," Curtis said, "but I've been scared before." "What did you do?" "Kept moving forward." Patterson nodded, not quite convinced, but there wasn't any other choice. Forward was the only direction that made sense. The channel was rough. Men vomited over the rails, too sick to care about dignity. Curtis kept his eyes on the horizon and thought about nothing. Thinking was dangerous. Thinking led to imagining all the ways the next few hours could go wrong. They hit the beach on June 22nd, almost 2 weeks after the initial D-Day assault. Omaha Beach had been secured, but evidence of the carnage remained. Burned-out vehicles, shell craters, debris that Curtis's mind refused to identify. The 102nd moved inland quickly, joining the slow, grinding advance through terrain that turned every field into a battlefield. Curtis Culin depression survivor, window trimmer, reluctant cavalryman, had arrived at the war that would define his generation. He still had no idea that in 3 weeks an offhand comment from a Tennessee hillbilly would make him a hero. But the war had a way of finding the men it needed, and Curtis Culin was exactly the kind of man the war needed now. The hedgerows didn't look like fortifications. That was the first thing Curtis Culin noticed as the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron moved inland from the beach. They looked like property lines, like the quaint agricultural boundaries you'd see in a painting or travel brochure. Thick walls of earth and tangled vegetation, perhaps 4 feet high, topped with centuries-old growth, brambles and bushes and trees whose roots had woven together into something that seemed organic and harmless. The Germans knew better. Curtis was riding in the lead scout car when the first shots came. Not the dramatic barrage you'd expect, but precise, measured fire from a position they couldn't see. The rounds sparked off the armored hull, and the driver, a farm kid from Passaic named Kowalski, jerked the wheel hard right, sending them careening into a ditch. Curtis tasted blood where he'd bitten his tongue. His ears rang. Behind them, someone was screaming into the radio, calling for support that would take too long to arrive. "Where are they?" Kowalski shouted. Curtis scanned the hedgerow 50 yards ahead. Nothing. Just green growth and shadows, and the absolute certainty that death was waiting behind that innocent-looking wall of vegetation. He'd never felt so exposed and so blind at the same time. The German machine gun opened up again, and this time Curtis saw the muzzle flash low, right at the base of the hedgerow, firing through a gap between roots that was invisible until you knew exactly where to look. The gunner had dug his position directly into the earthen bank, protected by tons of packed soil and centuries of root systems. Artillery wouldn't touch him. Rifle fire was useless, and approaching across the open field was suicide. Welcome to the bocage, Curtis thought. Welcome to hell with hedges. They called it the Battle of the Hedgerows. Though battle suggested something organized, something with front lines and objectives and a sense of progress, what Curtis experienced over the next 3 weeks was closer to drowning. A slow, suffocating struggle where every field was its own war, every hedgerow a fortress, every advance measured in yards bought with blood. The bocage stretched for miles in every direction, small, irregular fields none larger than a few hundred yards across, divided by earthen walls that the Normans had built over centuries, by clearing stones from their farmland and piling them at the edges. Time had done the rest. Dirt accumulated, seeds germinated, trees grew. By 1944, the result was a landscape that seemed designed by Satan himself to maximize defensive advantage. For the Germans, it was paradise. They'd arrived weeks before the invasion and had studied the terrain with the careful attention of men who knew they'd be fighting for every inch. They dug foxholes into the hedgerows themselves, creating positions that were invisible from the air, nearly impossible to suppress with artillery. They sighted their machine guns to cover the narrow gaps between fields, the only places tanks could pass without climbing. They planted mines along the obvious approach routes and strung barbed wire through the thick growth where attackers couldn't see it until they were tangled in it. For the Americans, it was a nightmare that made basic tactical doctrine useless. All the advantages that had won the war in North Africa, superior numbers, mechanized mobility, overwhelming firepower, meant nothing in terrain where you couldn't see 50 yards and tanks became death traps. Curtis learned the rules quickly. Rule 1, never cross an open field without suppressing fire. Rule 2, always assume the hedgerow ahead contained Germans. Rule 3, when you heard the burp of a German machine gun, you hit the ground before your brain finished processing the sound, because thinking took time you didn't have. On his third day in the bocage, Curtis watched a Sherman tank try to cross a hedgerow. The driver approached the earthen wall at speed, hoping momentum would carry them through. Instead, the tank's nose climbed the bank. The hull tilted backward at a 45-degree angle, and suddenly 30 tons of American steel were pointing at the sky with its belly exposed. The Germans had a Panzerfaust team waiting. The anti-tank rocket hit the Sherman's unarmored underside, and the tank exploded with a sound that Curtis would hear in his dreams for years. A deep, hollow boom, followed by the screaming of men burning alive inside steel coffins. 4 crew members. Curtis had played poker with the commander 2 nights earlier. Now they were gone, transformed from living men into casualties so fast that his mind couldn't process the transition. "Jesus Christ," Kowalski whispered. "Jesus Christ." But Christ wasn't taking calls from Normandy that summer. The infantry had it worse. Curtis at least had armor around him, thin as it was. The foot soldiers had nothing but cotton uniforms and the hope that the next burst of machine gun fire would miss. They advanced field by field, hedgerow by hedgerow, facing an enemy they could rarely see and couldn't effectively suppress. Curtis watched them work. A squad would stack up at a hedgerow trying to find a gap or a weak point in the vegetation. An officer would signal and they'd pour through. 8 or 10 men rushing across 30 yards of open ground while German machine guns traversed to meet them. Some made it, many didn't. The ones who survived would set up a base of fire while the next squad prepared to assault the next hedgerow, where the process would repeat. It took the 30th Infantry Division 2 weeks to advance 7 miles. They suffered nearly 4,000 casualties in that time. The mathematics were brutal. At that rate, you ran out of soldiers before you ran out of hedgerows. The nights were worse than the days. At least in daylight, you could see threats, could track movement, could maintain some illusion of control. But darkness in the bocage was absolute. A thick, humid blackness where every sound became a potential ambush and every shadow might conceal a German patrol. The 102nd ran night reconnaissance missions, probing enemy positions, trying to find weaknesses and defenses that seemed to have no weaknesses. Curtis developed an instinct for the work. He learned to navigate by compass and dead reckoning when visibility dropped to 0. He learned to distinguish the sound of American equipment from German, the different pitch of engines, the distinctive clatter of different weapons. He learned to read terrain by feel, to sense the subtle changes in slope and soil that might indicate a minefield or a prepared position. But mainly he learned to be afraid, a constant low-grade fear that made his hands shake when he thought about it too much. So he tried not to think at all. Just move, just follow orders, just survive another day in this green hell where death waited behind every wall of vegetation. By early July, the psychological toll was becoming visible. Men who'd been confident and competent on the beach were developing what the medics called combat fatigue. 1,000-yard stare, an inability to sleep, hands that trembled when there was no immediate danger. Some just stopped functioning, curled up in foxholes, and refused to move. Officers called it cowardice, but Curtis recognized it as something else. The human breaking point. The moment when the mind simply couldn't process any more horror and shut down in self-defense. He wondered when his own breaking point would arrive. The worst was watching the tank crews. Curtis knew most of them, had trained with them in England, had shared cigarettes and complaints, and the peculiar gallows humor that soldiers develop when death becomes routine. Now he watched them die in ways that seemed designed to maximize suffering. When a Sherman took a hit from German anti-tank fire, the crew had maybe 30 seconds to evacuate before ammunition cooked off and the whole thing became a crematorium. Sometimes they made it out. Often they didn't. Curtis pulled one man from a burning tank, a kid named Morrison who talked endlessly about his girl back in Ohio. Morrison's uniform was on fire, his face a mask of burns, and he kept screaming a name Curtis couldn't understand. The medics arrived and pumped him full of morphine, but Curtis knew Morrison wouldn't make it home to Ohio. The hedgerows were killing them, not quickly, not with the dramatic violence of a pitched battle, but slowly, relentlessly, grinding down the American forces one casualty at a time. And there was no solution. Engineers tried blowing gaps in the walls with explosives, but the detonations attracted immediate German attention. Bulldozers could push through, but they were slow and conspicuous, and the Germans targeted them specifically, knowing that destroying dozers meant slowing the American advance. Tanks could climb the hedgerows, but climbing meant exposing their vulnerable undersides to German anti-tank weapons. The crews knew it was suicide, but they did it anyway because those were the orders, and nobody had a better idea. Curtis started carrying a notebook. In the evenings, when the fighting paused and exhaustion made sleep impossible, he'd sketch problems and potential solutions. The engineer in him, the part that had survived by improvising during the Depression, refused to accept that the hedgerows were unsolvable. There had to be a way, some technique or tool or modification that would let them break through without bleeding themselves white. But every idea he had seemed impractical or too slow or likely to get men killed without achieving results. On July 11th, Curtis's unit supported an attack by the 29th Infantry Division near Saint-Lô. The objective was a small rise, Hill 122, that offered observation over the surrounding countryside. Taking it required crossing a kilometer of bocage under German fire. Curtis watched from his position as waves of infantry advanced into machine gun fire that was so precise and methodical, it seemed mechanical. The Americans took Hill 122, cost them over 1,000 casualties, and the next day, German counterattacks pushed them off it. That night, Curtis sat in a muddy foxhole and tried to calculate how long the Army could sustain losses like that. His mathematics were crude, but the conclusion was unavoidable. At current casualty rates, they'd run out of combat-effective units before they reached Germany. The hedgerows were winning. He wasn't the only one doing the math. General Omar Bradley, commander of 1st Army, was increasingly desperate. Bradley understood that his forces were caught in a war of attrition they couldn't win. The British and Canadians were similarly bogged down around Caen to the east. The entire Allied lodgment in France had stalled, and with it the hopes of ending the war in 1944. Bradley needed a breakthrough, something decisive, something that would restore mobility and allow his mechanized forces to exploit their advantages. He was planning Operation Cobra, a massive concentrated attack designed to rupture the German line south of Saint-Lô. But Cobra required tanks, and tanks couldn't function in the bocage. Not yet, anyway. Curtis didn't know about Cobra. He didn't know about Bradley's planning or Eisenhower's concerns or the strategic implications of the stalemate. He knew what every soldier in the bocage knew. They were dying, and nobody seemed to have a solution. On July 14th, Curtis's squad was assigned to escort a supply convoy through recently cleared territory. It should have been routine, a milk run in Army parlance, but in the bocage, nothing was routine. A German patrol had infiltrated back into supposedly secure area, and they hit the convoy with a perfectly executed ambush. Curtis's scout car took several hits. Kowalski slumped over the wheel, blood spreading across his shirt. Curtis grabbed the controls, drove them into cover, and returned fire with the car's machine gun. Not aiming, just suppressing, just trying to stay alive. The firefight lasted maybe 3 minutes. It felt like hours. When it was over, Kowalski was dead. 2 other men from the convoy were dead. Curtis had a superficial wound across his forearm that would scar, but wasn't serious. And the Germans had disappeared back into the hedgerows like ghosts, impossible to pursue, possible to bring to battle. Curtis helped load Kowalski's body onto a truck. The kid from Passaic who dreamed about returning to his father's farm was going home in a box. Curtis felt nothing, not grief, not anger, just a terrible numbness that was somehow worse than emotion. He'd seen too much death. His capacity for feeling had exceeded some critical threshold and simply shut down. That evening, exhausted and hollow, Curtis sat with a group of soldiers from various units. They were resting in what passed for safety, a small clearing surrounded by hedgerows they thought were clear of Germans. Someone had liberated a bottle of Calvados from a destroyed farmhouse, and they were passing it around, drinking and complaining with the weary cynicism of men who'd stopped believing they'd survive the war. A soldier Curtis didn't know, a tall, rangy kid with a Tennessee accent, was holding forth about the hedgerows. His name, Curtis would later learn, was Roberts. Private Roberts, an infantry replacement who'd arrived 3 days earlier and was already speaking with the authority of a veteran. "What we need," Roberts said, taking a pull from the bottle, "is something like saw teeth. Big steel teeth on the front of the tanks. Just cut right through these damn hedges instead of trying to climb over them." Several men laughed. It sounded absurd, the kind of idea you'd have after too much Calvados and too little sleep. Saw teeth on tanks, like something from a cartoon, but Curtis didn't laugh. Curtis was thinking about leverage and force and the properties of the hedgerows. Earthen walls with root systems, but ultimately just dirt and vegetation. Thinking about the German beach obstacles they'd pass coming inland, massive steel structures designed to rip the bottoms out of landing craft. steel that was just sitting there, salvage that nobody had any use for. Thinking about improvisation, about the lesson the Depression had taught him. When the world breaks, you fix it with whatever materials are available. Roberts kept talking, but Curtis had stopped listening. His engineer's mind was already designing something, sketching it mentally, calculating angles and stress points and feasibility. Steel prongs welded to a tank's front. Not saw teeth exactly, but tusks. Heavy angled tusks that could dig into the base of a hedgerow and hold the tank level while it pushed through instead of climbing over. It was absurd. It was crude. It might not work, but it might. Curtis pulled out his notebook and started sketching. The other soldiers were still laughing at Roberts' suggestion, still passing the bottle, still complaining about a problem they assumed was unsolvable. Curtis Culin was done complaining. He'd spent 3 weeks watching men die for lack of a Hakim solution. Now he had an idea, rough and unproven and probably crazy, but an idea nonetheless. He'd survived the Depression by improvising. Maybe he could survive the hedgerows the same way. The next morning, Curtis would take his sketches to his commanding officer. 3 days later, he'd demonstrate a working prototype to General Omar Bradley. And 11 days after that, Operation Cobra would begin with 60% of American tanks equipped with devices that a Tennessee hillbilly had joked about and a New Jersey sergeant had actually built. But that night, sitting in the mud with his notebook and his rough sketches, Curtis just felt tired. Tired and scared and determined. The hedgerows had been killing Americans for 3 weeks. It was time to kill the hedgerows back. Curtis didn't sleep that night. He lay in his foxhole with the notebook pressed against his chest, listening to distant artillery and closer sounds. Men coughing, someone crying quietly in the darkness, the rustle of rats moving through the debris of war. His mind was racing through calculations, refining the design he'd sketched, identifying problems before they could kill someone. The basic concept was simple. Weld steel prongs to the front of a tank angled downward. When the tank approached a hedgerow, the prongs would dig into the earthen base instead of letting the nose climb. The tank would stay level, maintaining traction, keeping its belly armor protected, and with 30 tons of Sherman pushing behind those steel tusks, they'd punch through the vegetation like a fist through wet paper. Simple in theory, but theory got men killed when it met reality. The steel would need to be heavy enough to penetrate packed earth and root systems, but not so heavy it compromised the tank's mobility or center of gravity. The angle had to be precise, too steep and the prongs would just push the tank up and over, too shallow and they wouldn't bite deep enough. The welds would need to withstand tremendous stress again and again without fatiguing or snapping, and where would they get the steel? Even if the design worked, manufacturing hundreds of these devices would require materials the Army didn't have, time they couldn't spare, an industrial capacity that didn't exist in a combat zone. Curtis stared at the darkness and thought about the beach, thought about the German obstacles they'd passed on their way inland, thousands of them, stretching for miles. The Germans had called them Czech hedgehogs, 6-foot steel beams welded together in an X pattern designed to tear the hulls off landing craft. Rommel had supervised their placement personally, creating a deadly obstacle field that had cost American lives on D-Day. But D-Day was over. The obstacles were just sitting there now, salvaged from a battle already won. High-grade steel, pre-cut to useful lengths, available in massive quantities, and absolutely free for the taking. Curtis felt something shift in his chest. Not quite. Hope. Hope was dangerous, but possibility. The raw materials existed. The idea was sound. All he needed was permission to try, access to welding equipment, and a tank crew willing to risk their lives on an untested modification dreamed up by a sergeant with a notebook. At first light, Curtis found his commanding officer. Captain Miller was 32 years old, which made him elderly by combat standards. He'd been a high school teacher in peacetime, which meant he understood that good ideas could come from unexpected sources. He was also exhausted, running on coffee and cigarettes, and the knowledge that his squadron was being ground down one casualty at a time. Curtis saluted. "Sir, I have an idea about the hedgerows." Miller looked up from the map he'd been studying. His eyes were bloodshot, his face unshaven. "Everyone has ideas about the hedgerows, Culin. Most of them involve cursing." This one involves steel, sir. Something in Curtis's voice must have registered. Miller gestured to a folding chair. Show me. Curtis opened his notebook and explained. As he talked, he watched Miller's expression shift from skepticism to interest, to something that might have been hope if hope hadn't been beaten out of him by 3 weeks of casualties. When Curtis mentioned using the German beach obstacles, Miller actually smiled, a brief, grim flash of satisfaction at the idea of turning Rommel's defenses into American weapons. You really think this would work? Miller asked. I think it's worth trying, sir. We're losing tanks every day the current way. This can't be worse. Miller studied the sketches for another moment. Then he stood. Get a jeep. We're going to the beach. The drive to Omaha Beach took 40 minutes through territory that had been purchased with blood Curtis could still smell. Destroyed vehicles lined the roads, German and American both, indistinguishable in death. The fields were cratered from artillery, marked with grave registration crosses, where bodies had been buried temporarily before shipment home. The beach itself was a surreal landscape of organized chaos. Supply officers were coordinating the flow of materials inland. Engineers were maintaining the temporary harbors, and scattered across the sand, rusting in the salt air, were thousands of Czech hedgehogs, steel X patterns that had failed to stop the invasion, and now served no purpose except as obstacles to logistics operations. Curtis and Miller walked among them. Up close, the hedgehogs were even more impressive. Massive I-beams, each 6 feet long, welded together in patterns designed to gut ships. The steel was high quality, German industrial stock. The whales were professional, and there were enough hedgehogs to modify every tank in France twice over. Take what you need, Miller said. I'll clear it with division. You got 48 hours to build a prototype. Curtis felt his heart rate accelerate. This was real now. Not a midnight sketch, but an actual project. With actual stakes. And if it worked, he might save lives. If it failed, he'd have wasted time and resources the Army couldn't afford to waste. I'll need a tank crew, sir. Volunteers? I'll find them. What else? Cutting torches, arc welding equipment, a mechanic who knows how to work with armor plate, and someone from ordnance who can calculate stress loads. Miller nodded. You'll have it by noon. Don't make me regret this, Culin. No, sir. The work began immediately. Curtis selected 4 hedgehogs and had them loaded onto a truck. Back at the unit's maintenance area, he found what he needed, a technical sergeant named Martinez, who'd worked in a Detroit auto plant before the war, a welder named Dombrowski, who could make steel sing in a tank, an M4 Sherman that had taken minor damage and been pulled from the line for repairs, and he found a crew. Lieutenant Harris and his 4-man team had lost their tank 2 days earlier when it tried to climb a hedgerow and exposed its belly to a Panzerfaust. They'd all survived, but barely. The commander had burns on his hands. The gunner walked with a limp. They had the haunted look of men who'd felt death's hand on their shoulders and knew it would reach for them again. Sir, Curtis said to Harris, I want to modify a tank. It's experimental. It might not work. But if it does, you won't have to climb hedgerows anymore. Harris looked at the sketches. When do we start? They worked through the day and into the night, illuminated by work lights that made them targets but couldn't be avoided. Martinez cut the hedgehog beams into sections using an acetylene torch, the metal screaming as it separated. Curtis calculated angles, made measurements, adjusted the design as theory met reality. Dombrowski prepared the welding equipment and studied the Sherman's hull, identifying the best mounting points. The basic design called for 4 prongs, steel tusks angled forward and down, reinforced with crossbars mounted directly to the Sherman's front armor. Each prong would be about 5 feet long, sharpened to a point, positioned to dig into the base of a hedgerow when the tank made contact. The weight was significant, several hundred pounds of added steel, but Martinez assured Curtis the Sherman's suspension could handle it. The first weld went down at 2300 hours. Dombrowski worked with meticulous care, knowing that a bad weld meant a dead crew. The arc light was brilliant in the darkness, casting strange shadows across the maintenance area. Curtis watched, checking measurements, comparing reality to his sketches, making adjustments on the fly. Other soldiers gathered to watch. Word had spread that something unusual was happening, that a sergeant from the 102nd had a crazy idea about the hedgerows. Some watched with curiosity, others with skepticism. All of them, with the desperate hope of men who needed a miracle and knew miracles didn't exist. Private Roberts showed up around midnight. The Tennessee soldier who'd made the offhand comment about saw teeth studied the device taking shape on the Sherman's front. "I'll be damned," Roberts said. "You actually did it." Curtis looked up from his calculations. "You gave me the idea. I was drunk and talking shit." "Best kind of inspiration?" Roberts laughed, a brief, surprised bark of sound in the darkness. "If this works, you're buying me a drink in Paris?" "If this works," Curtis said, "I'll buy you drinks for a year." The welding continued. Dombrowski was an artist, laying down bead after bead of perfect weld, fusing the steel prongs to the Sherman's armor with bonds that would have to withstand impacts that could shatter bones. Martinez fabricated reinforcing braces, triangulating the load, ensuring the force would distribute across the hull instead of concentrating at weak points. By dawn, the device was complete. 4 steel tusks protruded from the Sherman like fangs, angled downward at precisely 15 degrees. It looked brutal, primitive, like something medieval warriors would have mounted on battering rams. Lieutenant Harris walked around the tank studying the modification from every angle. His crew did the same, faces unreadable. They'd be the ones testing this device. They'd be the ones dying if Curtis's calculations were wrong. "What are we calling it?" Harris asked. Curtis hadn't thought about names. "I don't know. The prong device, the hedgerow cutter, looks like a rhinoceros," the gunner said. "You know, with the horns." Harris nodded. "Rhino, yeah, that works." The Rhino. Curtis liked it, something powerful and unstoppable and maybe a little bit prehistoric, something that matched the brutal simplicity of the design. "When do we test it?" Harris asked. "Now," Curtis said. They selected a hedgerow about a quarter-mile from the maintenance area. Thick vegetation on a substantial earthen bank, representative of what they'd face in combat. A small crowd had gathered to watch. Captain Miller was there, so was Major Anderson from battalion headquarters. Word had spread through the unit that something significant was happening. Harris and his crew mounted up. The Sherman's engine roared to life, belching diesel smoke. Curtis felt his stomach tighten. This was the moment. Either his idea worked or he'd just wasted materials and time and potentially damaged a tank the Army needed. The Sherman began to roll, slowly at first, then building speed, 30 miles per hour. Harris was giving it full throttle, committing completely, because half measures would teach them nothing. The tank hit the hedgerow with a sound like thunder. The steel prongs dug into the earthen base. The Sherman's nose dropped slightly as the tusks bit deep, then the momentum carried it forward. Dirt exploded upward. Vegetation sheared away. The tank plowed through the hedgerow like it was tissue paper, emerging on the other side in a cloud of dirt and shredded plant matter, belly armor intact, guns still pointed at the horizon instead of the sky. Perfect. Curtis felt his knees go weak. It worked. The calculations had been correct. The welds had held. The design had translated from notebook to reality without killing anyone. The crowd erupted. Soldiers were cheering, pounding each other on the back, their voices raw with something Curtis hadn't heard in weeks. Hope. Real, genuine hope that maybe they'd found a solution to the nightmare that had been killing them field by field. Harris backed the tank up and hit the hedgerow again. Same result, clean penetration, no exposure of the vulnerable underside. Again and again, demonstrating that it wasn't luck, but genuine effectiveness. Captain Miller was grinning. Major Anderson was already on the radio, calling higher headquarters. And Curtis just stood there, watching the Sherman plow through hedgerows that had seemed invincible 24 hours earlier. Private Roberts walked over and offered his hand. "Paris," he said, "don't forget." "I won't," Curtis promised, but the celebration was premature. The prototype worked, but one tank didn't win wars. They needed hundreds of these devices. Thousands, maybe, and they needed them immediately because Operation Cobra was scheduled for July 25th, 10 days away, and Bradley had made clear that the breakthrough depended on armor mobility. Curtis was already thinking about production, about logistics and welding equipment and how many devices one team could manufacture per day, about training crews to use them effectively, about all the problems that stood between a successful prototype and an actual solution. The next morning, Curtis was summoned to division headquarters. He'd never been to division headquarters before. Sergeants didn't get invited to places where generals made decisions, but Captain Miller had insisted. And when Curtis arrived, he understood why. General Omar Bradley was there. Bradley, the soldier's general, commander of First Army, the man responsible for winning the war in France. He was standing next to a hedgerow, watching as Harris demonstrated the Rhino device again, and his face showed the first genuine optimism Curtis had seen from any senior officer since the invasion. "Sergeant Culin," Bradley said. Curtis saluted. "Yes, sir. This is your design?" "Based on an idea from Private Roberts, sir. I just worked out the engineering." Bradley studied him for a moment. "Modest, I appreciate that. Now tell me the truth. Can we mass produce these things in time for Cobra?" Curtis thought about it, thought about the raw materials available, the welding capacity, the training requirements. "If we commit every ordnance unit in First Army to round-the-clock production, sir, we can probably equip 60% of your tanks in 10 days. 60%. "Yes, sir. Maybe more if we get lucky." Bradley turned back to watch the Sherman plow through another hedgerow. 60% is enough. Make it happen, Sergeant. I don't care what resources you need. This device just became the highest priority in First Army." "Yes, sir." As Curtis turned to leave, Bradley called after him. "Culin, you just saved a lot of lives. Don't forget that when people start taking credit for this." Curtis nodded. He didn't care about credit. He cared about Kowalski and Morrison and all the others who died because tanks couldn't cross hedgerows without exposing their bellies. He cared about making sure no more men burned alive because of a tactical problem that finally had a solution. The production order went out that afternoon. Every ordnance unit in First Army was directed to manufacture hedgerow cutters using captured German steel. Additional arc welding equipment was flown in from England. Teams of welders worked 24-hour shifts. Tank crews lined up to have their Shermans modified, and maintenance areas became assembly lines. Curtis supervised where he could, trained welding teams, answered technical questions, refined the design based on feedback from crews. He barely slept. There wasn't time. Cobra was coming, and every tank without a Rhino device was a tank that might get its crew killed. Private Roberts found him on July the 20th. Curtis was checking welds on a freshly modified Sherman, exhausted and running on coffee that tasted like diesel fuel. "Heard you're becoming famous," Roberts said. Curtis looked up. "Heard you started this whole thing with a drunken comment." "Yeah, but you actually built it. That's the difference between talking and doing." Curtis thought about that. Thought about all the nights in England when soldiers had complained about problems without offering solutions. Thought about how many good ideas died because nobody had the energy or the courage or the engineering knowledge to make them real. "You deserve credit," Curtis said. "I'm going to make sure people know." Roberts shrugged. "Now, credit doesn't matter. What matters is that when we go into Saint-Lô, the tanks can actually support us instead of becoming targets. That's worth more than my name in a report." He was right. The credit didn't matter. What mattered was that in 5 days, Operation Cobra would launch with hundreds of Rhino tanks. And maybe, just maybe, they'd finally break through the hedgerows and start winning this war. Curtis Culin, Depression survivor, window trimmer, reluctant sergeant, had solved a problem that had baffled the entire American Army. He'd done it with German steel and American welders, and the kind of practical improvisation that came from growing up poor in hard times. The bocage had been killing Americans for a month. Now it was time to kill the bocage, and Curtis had built the weapon to do it. The beach at dawn looked like an industrial graveyard. Thousands of Czech hedgehogs stretched across the sand, their steel beams catching the early light, casting shadows that resembled prison bars. 4 weeks ago, these obstacles had been part of Rommel's Atlantic Wall, designed to stop the greatest invasion in history. Now they were raw material for an improvisation that might win the war. Curtis stood among them with a cutting torch and a sense of historical irony that would have been funny if men weren't dying. Rommel had spent years fortifying these beaches. German engineers had calculated the optimal placement of each obstacle. Thousands of workers had welded the steel beams, driven them into the sand, creating a defensive network that was supposed to be impenetrable. And now Curtis Culin was taking them apart to build something that would help destroy the army Rommel had tried to protect. "Sergeant," a corporal from Ordnance was waiting with a clipboard. "We've got 23 cutting teams ready. Where do you want them?" Curtis surveyed the beach, split them into 3 groups, north sector, middle, and south. Cut every hedgehog down to transportable pieces, 5-foot sections, just like the specifications. Stack them by the access roads where trucks can reach them. "All of them, Sergeant?" "Every single one. We're going to need more steel than you think." The corporal looked at the thousands of obstacles stretching into the distance. "That's going to take days. We've got 4 days until Cobra. Move." The operation began immediately. Cutting teams spread across the beach, their acetylene torches flaring blue-white in the morning air. The sound was cacophonous, metal screaming as it separated, generators roaring, men shouting coordinates and measurements. It was organized chaos, the kind of barely controlled frenzy that happened when the Army committed completely to a single objective. Curtis moved between teams, checking their work, ensuring the cuts were clean and the measurements precise. Every piece of steel would become part of a hedgerow cutter. Every bad cut meant wasted material and wasted time. There was no margin for error. By noon, the first trucks were rolling inland, loaded with cut steel. Curtis rode in the lead vehicle, his notebook open, calculating production rates in his head. If each ordnance unit could manufacture 3 cutters per day and they had 20 units committed to the task, that was 60 devices daily. They needed at least 500 to equip 60% of First Army's tanks. 8 days of production at maximum capacity, but Cobra was in 4 days. At the main ordnance depot near Isigny, Curtis found organized pandemonium. Welding stations had been set up in every available space, under camouflage netting, inside damaged buildings, in open fields where concealment was impossible. Each station had a crew, a cutter, a welder, and a fitter, who positioned the components before final assembly. The air smelled of hot metal and welding flux and the diesel smoke from generators. Lieutenant Colonel Medeiros, the First Army Ordnance officer, was coordinating the effort with the intensity of a man who understood that failure meant dead soldiers. He spotted Curtis and waved him over. "Your device better?" "Works, Sergeant." "It works, sir. I've seen it tested a dozen times." "Good. Because I've got General Bradley calling me every 2 hours asking for production numbers." Medeiros gestured at the organized chaos around them. "This is the highest priority operation in the European theater right now. Higher than ammunition production, higher than vehicle maintenance. Everything stops until we've built enough of these things." Curtis felt the weight of that responsibility settle on his shoulders. Hundreds of welders were working because of his design. Thousands of tank crews were counting on devices he'd sketched in a notebook 4 days ago. If the cutters failed in combat, if the welds cracked or the steel bent or the whole concept proved fatally flawed under real battlefield conditions, those failures would be his fault. "We'll make it work, sir," Curtis said with more confidence than he felt. The production line was surprisingly efficient. Each cutter required 4 main prongs cut from hedgehog beams, plus reinforcing crossbars and mounting brackets. The components were prefabricated at cutting stations, then moved to welding stations, where they were assembled into complete units. A finished cutter weighed approximately 450 pounds, heavy enough to dig into hedgerows, but not so heavy it compromised tank mobility. Curtis watched the first complete unit roll off the line at 1400 hours. It looked identical to his prototype, which meant the design was reproducible. That was crucial. In combat, standardization meant reliability, and reliability meant lives saved. "How long per unit?" Curtis asked the welding supervisor. "About 4 hours with experienced welders, 6 with the green ones." Curtis did the math. 20 stations working round the clock meant roughly 100 cutters per day. They'd have 400 by the time Cobra launched. Not the 500 he'd hoped for, but enough to make a difference. "Keep 'em moving," Curtis said, "and double-check every weld. I don't want a single device failing because someone got sloppy." The supervisor nodded. "We're checking them, Sergeant. Nobody wants to be the guy who got a tank crew killed with a bad weld." That was the truth that drove everything. This wasn't abstract manufacturing. Every device they built would be mounted on a tank, and 5 men would trust their lives to the quality of workmanship. That knowledge made the welders careful and the inspectors paranoid, which was exactly what Curtis wanted. By evening, the production rhythm had stabilized. Curtis moved between stations, answering technical questions, solving problems as they emerged. A welder in Station 7 was having trouble with the angle on his prongs. Curtis adjusted the jig. Station 12 had questions about mounting brackets for different Sherman variants. Curtis sketched modifications that would work for all models. He was running on coffee and cigarettes and the peculiar energy that came from knowing you were making a difference. For 3 weeks, Curtis had felt helpless, watching men die because of a tactical problem nobody could solve. Now he was solving it, one welded joint at a time. At 2200 hours, a crisis emerged. The welding equipment at Station 4 had failed. A burned-out transformer in the arc welder. Replacement parts were in England, which meant days of delay. Station 4 was one of the most productive units, staffed by experienced welders from Detroit who could build a cutter in 3.5 hours. Curtis stared at the dead equipment and thought through options. They couldn't wait for replacement parts. They couldn't afford to lose Station 4's production capacity, which meant they needed to improvise. "Can we transfer a transformer from another piece of equipment?" Curtis asked the maintenance chief. "Not without shutting down something else." "What about captured German equipment? They must have welders." The maintenance chief considered that. "There's a German maintenance depot about 3 miles east. We overran it last week. Might be salvageable equipment there." "Get a recovery team. I want every piece of working welding equipment stripped out of that depot and back here by dawn." "That's technically looting enemy property, Sergeant." Curtis looked at him. "Rommel built those beach obstacles to kill Americans. Now we're turning his steel into hedgerow cutters. You think he'd object to us borrowing his welding equipment, too?" The maintenance chief grinned. "When you put it that way, I'll have a team there in 20 minutes. By dawn on July 22nd, Station 4 was operational again, running on a German transformer that hummed with a slightly different pitch than the American equipment, but worked perfectly. Curtis allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Improvisation was becoming a habit. The production numbers were climbing, 100 cutters on day 1, 120 on day 2 as the crews refined their techniques and learned to work faster without sacrificing quality. Curtis barely slept, moving between stations, checking welds, ensuring every device met specifications. On July 23rd, the first batch of completed cutters was delivered to forward tank units. Curtis went with them, needing to see how the installation process worked in field conditions. The tank crews received the devices with a mixture of hope and skepticism. They'd been promised solutions before, and most of those promises had gotten men killed. Curtis supervised the first installation personally. The process was straightforward. Position the cutter against the Sherman's front armor, mark the mounting points, weld it in place. With a good crew, installation took about 2 hours. Some units were already calling them Rhino tanks, and the nickname was spreading. Lieutenant Harris, who tested the original prototype, was training other crews on how to use the devices effectively. "You approach the hedgerow at speed," he explained, but not so fast. "You lose control. The prongs dig in, the tank stays level, you punch through. Don't try to climb over, don't try to go around, just hit it straight on and trust the device." Trust. That was the key. Tank crews had to trust that the cutters would work, that the welds would hold, that they wouldn't end up belly up with a Panzerfaust coming at their unprotected underside. Curtis watched crew after crew test their newly modified tanks. Most were successful. A few had problems. One cutter bent when it hit an unusually thick hedgerow with embedded stones. Curtis made notes, adjusted the design specifications slightly, ensured future units would be reinforced at the stress points. By the evening of July 23rd, 280 cutters had been installed on tanks across First Army. They were running behind schedule, but not catastrophically. If production held through July 24th, they'd have close to 400 Rhino tanks ready for Cobra. That night, Curtis was summoned to a briefing for Operation Cobra. The command tent was full of officers studying maps and discussing fire coordination and assault sequences. Curtis felt out of place. He was a sergeant in a room full of colonels and generals, but General Bradley had insisted he attend. "Gentlemen," Bradley said, "most of you have heard about the hedgerow cutter. Sergeant Culin is here to brief you on capabilities and limitations." Curtis stood. Public speaking had never been his strength, but the information was critical. The Rhino device allows tanks to penetrate hedgerows without exposing vulnerable undersides. We'll have approximately 400 equipped tanks by AH hour. That's 60% of your armor. What about the other 40%? The colonel asked. They'll have to use traditional tactics or wait for gaps to be blown by the Rhinos. Failure rate? Less than 2% in testing. Most failures are due to hitting hedgerows with unusual internal structures, buried stone walls, that kind of thing. Crews learn to identify those visually and avoid them. What if a cutter breaks in combat? Curtis had thought about that. The tank can still operate, but it shouldn't attempt to breach more hedgerows. Fall back to a support role. Bradley nodded. The Rhino tanks will lead the assault. Conventional tanks follow through the gaps. Any questions? There were dozens of questions. Technical details, tactical applications, maintenance requirements. Curtis answered them all, drawing on 4 days of intensive production experience and a lifetime of practical problem solving. When the briefing ended, Bradley pulled him aside. You look exhausted, Sergeant. I'll rest after Cobra, sir. See that you do. You've done good work here. Important work. Bradley paused. There's talk of a decoration, Legion of Merit, maybe. Curtis shook his head. Private Roberts deserves the credit, sir. It was his idea. I've heard that story multiple times, always from you. Bradley smiled slightly. An honest man, that's rare. The Legion of Merit recommendation will include Roberts' contribution, but you're the one who made it real, Culin. Don't forget that. The final production push began on July 24th. Every ordnance unit worked through the day and night, welders taking short breaks and returning to their stations, cutters operating until the acetylene torches ran dry and fresh tanks arrived. The beaches were nearly cleared of hedgehogs now, thousands of obstacles reduced to component pieces, Rommel's steel repurposed into American weapons. Curtis moved through the organized chaos like a ghost, too tired to sleep, too driven to stop. He checked welds, verified measurements, ensured quality control when exhausted workers started making mistakes. At some point, Captain Miller forcibly sat him down and made him eat. At another point, a medic gave him something that might have been amphetamines and might have been industrial-grade coffee. By midnight on July 24th, the count stood at 378 completed cutters. Not quite 400, but close enough. Bradley's staff had adjusted the battle plan to account for actual numbers. The Rhino tanks would spearhead the assault. Everything depended on them working as designed. Curtis stood on a hill overlooking the assembly areas where hundreds of tanks were gathered for the attack. In the darkness, he could see their shapes, Shermans with steel tusks protruding from their front armor, looking prehistoric and deadly. Crews were performing final maintenance, checking systems, loading ammunition. Tomorrow they'd drive into the hedgerows that had been killing Americans for a month, and this time they'd drive straight through. Private Roberts found him there. The Tennessee soldier looked as exhausted as Curtis felt. Couldn't sleep, Roberts said. Me neither. You think it'll work? Really work, I mean, in actual combat, not just tests. Curtis thought about the question honestly. The engineering's sound, the welds are good, the devices performed well in testing, but combat as a way of breaking things, that should work. That's not very reassuring. No, but it's true. They stood in silence, watching the tanks below. Somewhere in that darkness were men Curtis knew, Harris and his crew, Martinez and Dombrowski, dozens of others who'd worked on the project. Tomorrow they'd find out if 4 days of frantic production had created a solution or just a more elaborate way to die. Roberts? Curtis said, Yeah? Thank you. For making a drunk comment about saw teeth. For not being too embarrassed to suggest something that sounded crazy. Roberts laughed quietly. Thank you for being crazy enough to actually build it. At 400 hours on July 25th, the preparatory bombardment began. Hundreds of aircraft filled the sky, dropping bombs on German positions south of St. Lo. The ground shook with impacts that could be felt miles away. Curtis watched from an observation post, knowing that behind that curtain of explosive violence, tank crews were mounting up, checking their Rhino devices one final time, preparing to advance into hell. Operation Cobra had begun. Curtis didn't pray. He'd lost whatever faith he'd once had somewhere in the Depression, but he hoped. Hope that his calculations were correct. Hope that the welders had done their jobs properly. Hope that Private Roberts' drunk comment and Curtis Culin's midnight sketches would prove to be the key that unlocked the bocage and saved American lives. At 6 hunt hours, the first Rhino tanks crossed the line of departure. Curtis waited for reports, waited to learn if he'd succeeded or failed, if he'd solved the hedgerow problem or just created a more elaborate way for men to die. The radio crackled, a forward observer's voice distorted by static but clear enough. Rhino tanks are through. Repeat, Rhino tanks have penetrated the hedgerows. Breakthrough achieved. Curtis felt his legs give out, sat down heavily, hands shaking, the weight of 4 days lifting all at once. It worked. The device worked. Men were driving through hedgerows instead of dying against them. Captain Miller found him there, sitting in the dirt with his face in his hands. "You did it, Culin. You crazy son of a bitch. You actually did it." Curtis looked up. "Roberts did it. I just worked out the engineering. However it happened, you just changed the war. Those tanks are breaking through all along the line. The German defense is collapsing." Curtis nodded, too exhausted to feel triumph. He'd solved the problem, used Rommel's steel to break Rommel's defenses, turned German beach obstacles into American breakthrough weapons. It was the most important work Curtis Culin would ever do. But the war wasn't finished with him yet. In 4 months, in a frozen forest on the German border, the war would take payment for his success. Everything had a price, even victory. The forest looked like something from a Brothers Grimm nightmare. Dense conifers pressed close on both sides of the narrow trail, their branches forming a canopy so thick that even at midday the light was gray and uncertain. Fog clung to the ground, obscuring the mud that sucked at Curtis's boots with each step. Somewhere ahead, artillery was falling, the dull crump of impacts muffled by the trees, making it impossible to judge distance or direction. Curtis had been in combat for 5 months now, 5 months since Operation Cobra broke through the bocage and unleashed Patton's tanks across France. 5 months since his hedgerow cutter became the key that unlocked the German defensive line. 5 months of watching men die in ways that made the bocage seem merciful by comparison. The 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron had advanced across France, through Belgium, and now into Germany itself. They'd been among the first American units to cross the German border back in September, probing the Siegfried Line defenses, searching for weaknesses in fortifications that seemed to have none. And now they were in the Hürtgen Forest, 50 square miles of hell where American tactical advantages meant nothing, and men died for yards of muddy ground that nobody wanted. "Sergeant," the voice belonged to Patterson, the replacement who'd joined the unit after Kowalski died in Normandy. He was 19 now, which meant he'd been 18 when he first saw combat. "Captain wants you forward. Says there's a minefield blocking the advance." Curtis adjusted his rifle and moved up the column. The trail, calling it a road would have been generous, was barely wide enough for a jeep. On both sides, the forest was a tangle of undergrowth and fallen timber, terrain that channeled movement and made ambush inevitable. The Germans had fortified this hellscape with their usual efficiency. Bunkers built into the hillsides, minefields sown along every obvious approach. Artillery pre-registered on every intersection and clearing. Captain Miller was studying a map when Curtis arrived, though maps were nearly useless in terrain where you couldn't see more than 50 yards. Miller looked older than he had in Normandy. They all did. The Hürtgen was aging men in ways that normal time couldn't match. Culin, good. Miller pointed at the trail ahead. Engineers swept this route yesterday, said it was clear. This morning, a jeep hit a mine right there. He indicated a crater 30 yards forward where metal fragments and darker stains marked where men had died, which means either the engineers missed some or the Germans infiltrated last night and reseeded the area. Curtis studied the terrain. Both explanations were possible. The Germans were masters of night operations, moving silently through the forest to reposition mines, set up ambushes, and generally make every foot of ground as lethal as possible. And the engineers were exhausted working under fire, clearing paths through minefields that stretched for miles. "What do you need, sir?" "I need someone to scout forward and determine if we can get vehicles through. If not, we're stuck here, and battalion is screaming for us to link up with the 28th Division before dark." Curtis looked at the forest, looked at the crater, looked at the fog that made visibility a matter of luck rather than skill. Everything about this screamed trap, but staying in place meant presenting a stationary target to German artillery, and movement meant accepting the risk of mines. The mathematics of combat in the Hürtgen were simple. You could die standing still or die moving forward. At least moving forward accomplished something. "I'll take a patrol," Curtis said. 3 men, light and fast. Miller nodded. 1 hour. If you're not back by then, I'm assuming you're dead, and we'll try another route. It was the kind of casual fatalism that had become normal. Curtis selected Patterson and 2 other soldiers, Dominguez and Chen, both veterans who'd survived long enough to develop the paranoid caution that kept men alive. They moved forward slowly, weapons ready, eyes scanning for the telltale signs of mines, disturbed earth, tripwires, metallic glints in the leaf litter. The crater was worse, up close. Curtis could see where the mine had detonated directly under the Jeep's engine block, shaped charge punching upward through the floor. The driver and passenger hadn't stood a chance. Their bodies had been removed, but blood and tissue remained, already attracting flies despite the cold. "Jesus," Patterson whispered. "Stay focused," Curtis said quietly. "Talking gets you killed out here." They moved past the crater, Curtis in the lead, placing each foot carefully, looking for pressure plates or tripwires or any indication that the Germans had prepared this trail as a killing ground. The forest pressed close, claustrophobic and menacing. Somewhere to the left, Curtis heard movement, animal or human, impossible to tell. He froze, hand raised, and the patrol stopped behind him. 30 seconds. A minute. Nothing emerged from the fog. Curtis exhaled slowly and continued forward. They'd covered maybe 100 yards when Dominguez spotted the wire. It was strung ankle high across the trail, nearly invisible in the dim light, connected to something buried in the undergrowth. Curtis knelt beside it, studying the setup. Standard German booby trap. The wire was the trigger, but the actual mine was offset, positioned to catch the person who stepped backward after hitting the wire. "Mark it," Curtis said. "We'll have engineers deal with it on the way back." They marked the wire with a strip of white cloth and continued. Every few yards they found more evidence of German activity. Empty ration tins, cigarette butts, boot prints in the mud. The enemy had been here recently, which meant they might still be here, watching from concealed positions, waiting for Americans to blunder into prepared ambushes. Curtis was 50 yards ahead of the others when he saw the clearing. It was small, maybe 20 yards across, where several trees had been knocked down by artillery. The ground was churned mud and splintered timber, and something about it made Curtis's instincts scream danger. He raised his fist, signaling the patrol to halt, studied the clearing from the tree line. It looked empty, but that meant nothing. The Germans were experts at camouflage, at turning terrain into traps that wouldn't be visible until you were already dying. Curtis picked up a fallen branch and tossed it into the clearing. It landed with a wet thump. Nothing happened. He tossed another branch, aiming for a different spot. Still nothing. Maybe the clearing was actually clear. Maybe his paranoia was seeing threats that didn't exist. Or maybe the Germans had sown the area with mines and were waiting for someone to commit fully before detonating them remotely. "We go around," Curtis decided. "North side. Single file. Watch where I step." They began to circle the clearing, moving through undergrowth that was thick enough to hide entire infantry companies. Curtis was intensely aware of every sound, his own breathing, the soft rustle of equipment, the distant artillery that never quite stopped. He'd been in combat long enough to know that the universe didn't care about your caution or your fear. Sometimes you did everything right and still died. Sometimes you made mistakes and survived. There was no justice to it, no logic, just probability and luck, and eventually everyone's luck ran out. Curtis was 10 feet from the clearing's edge when his boot found the mine. He felt it, the subtle gyve beneath his foot, the slight depression that meant he'd triggered a pressure plate. Time didn't slow down the way stories claimed. Time just continued at its normal pace while Curtis's brain processed the information and reached the inevitable conclusion he was about to die. The mine was German, probably a shoe mine, wooden case to avoid metal detectors, packed with enough explosive to remove a foot or shatter a leg. Curtis had seen the results dozens of times, men screaming as they bled out from shredded arteries, medics working frantically with tourniquets, the terrible choice between dying quickly or living as a cripple. His first thought was oddly practical. At least it's not an S-mine. Those were worse. Bounding mines that leaped to waist height before detonating, designed to shred multiple soldiers with a single explosion. A pressure mine would just kill him, which seemed almost merciful by comparison. His second thought was about his mother. She'd be getting a telegram, regret to inform you, killed in action. The same telegram thousands of mothers had received and would continue receiving until this war finally ended. His third thought was interrupted by the explosion. The world became sound and pressure and pain that exceeded Curtis's capacity to process. He was on the ground, though he didn't remember falling. His left leg felt wrong, not painful exactly, but absent, as if it belonged to someone else. He tried to move it, and nothing happened. Tried again with the same result. Patterson was screaming something Curtis couldn't understand. The ringing in his ears drowned out everything except a high-pitched whine that seemed to originate inside his skull. Curtis looked down at his leg, or where his leg should have been, and saw blood spreading across the mud, dark and thick and pumping in rhythm with his heartbeat. Shock hit then, a curious detachment that made the scene feel unreal. Curtis watched Patterson apply a tourniquet with frantic efficiency, watched Dominguez get on the radio calling for medics, watched Chen provide security despite the fact that any Germans in the area now knew exactly where they were. It was like watching a movie where Curtis happened to be the main character, but couldn't quite connect that reality to his actual experience. The pain arrived shortly after, overwhelming the shock, a white-hot agony that made Curtis cry, out despite himself. His leg, what remained of it, felt like it was on fire, like someone had replaced bone and muscle with molten metal. Patterson was saying something about holding on, about medics coming, about staying conscious, but Curtis's vision was narrowing to a gray tunnel with darkness at the edges. He'd seen men die from shock and blood loss, seen them fade away despite the medics' best efforts, life draining out of them like water from a cracked vessel. Was that happening to him now? Was this how Curtis Culin ended? Not heroically in combat, but stupidly, stepping on a mine while scouting a trail that probably didn't even matter? The morphine hit his system like a blessing. The pain receded to something manageable, and with it came a strange clarity. Curtis understood he was badly wounded, probably crippled, possibly dying. Understood that his war was over regardless of whether he survived the next few hours. Understood that the hedgerow cutter, his moment of importance, the thing that had made him matter, was already fading into history, while Curtis himself faced an uncertain future of rehabilitation and disability. The medics arrived. How much time had passed, Curtis couldn't say. They worked with practiced efficiency, checking the tourniquet, administering plasma, preparing him for evacuation. One of them was talking to Curtis, asking questions to assess his mental state, but Curtis couldn't focus enough to respond coherently. The evacuation was a blur. They loaded him onto a stretcher, carried him back down the trail he just scouted, loaded him into an ambulance that somehow navigated the terrible roads to a field hospital. Curtis faded in and out of consciousness, catching fragments. The smell of ether and antiseptic, someone cutting away his boot and finding less leg than they expected, the sound of a saw that Curtis really hoped wasn't being used on him. When he woke up properly, he was in a real hospital bed in what someone said was Belgium. A doctor was standing beside him, a young captain with tired eyes who'd probably performed hundreds of amputations in the past few months. "Sergeant Culin, can you hear me?" Curtis nodded. His throat was too dry to speak. "You're going to be all right. We had to amputate below the knee. The damage was too extensive to save the foot, but you're alive, and that's what matters." Alive. Curtis processed that information slowly. Alive, but crippled. Alive, but done with the war. Alive, but fundamentally changed in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. "Private Roberts?" Curtis managed to croak. The doctor looked confused. "I'm sorry?" "Tennessee. Soldier. Hedgerow cutter." Understanding dawned. "Your friend?" "I don't know, Sergeant, but we can try to find out." Curtis closed his eyes. The morphine was pulling him back under, and he didn't fight it. There would be time later to process what had happened, to understand that the war had taken payment for his success, to figure out how Curtis Culin would exist as a civilian with one leg and a legion of merit and memories of men who died in hedgerows and forests. For now, he just let the darkness take him. 4 months ago, Curtis had solved a problem that saved thousands of lives. Today, the war had collected its debt. In the brutal mathematics of combat, that was how it worked. You couldn't save everyone, not even yourself. The prosthetic leg sat on the table like an accusation. Wood and leather and metal joints, engineered to replace what a German landmine had taken, designed to let Curtis Culin walk again like a normal man. Except Curtis didn't feel normal, and he suspected he never would again. "You'll need to practice," the specialist said. His name was Dr. Brennan, and he'd fitted prosthetics for hundreds of amputees in the past year. Walking with an artificial limb takes time to master. Muscle memory, balance, weight distribution. It's all different now. Curtis stared at the device. It looked primitive, medieval even, despite being the product of modern medical engineering. "How long?" "Weeks, maybe months. Everyone adapts at their own pace." Brennan's voice was professionally encouraging, the tone of a man who delivered this speech too many times. "Some men are walking within days, others take longer. The important thing is persistence." Persistence. Curtis almost laughed. He'd survived the Depression through persistence, survived the bocage through persistence, and persistence had carried him through the Hürtgen Forest, right up until the moment it couldn't anymore, until a German mine had literally cut him down. "What if I can't?" Curtis asked quietly. Brennan looked at him, really looked, not with professional detachment, but with something closer to empathy. "Then you use crutches, or a wheelchair. There's no shame in it, Sergeant. You've already given more than most men ever will." But shame wasn't about logic. Curtis felt diminished, reduced from the man who'd engineered a solution to the hedgerows into someone who needed help standing up. The war had taken his leg, and with it some essential part of his identity that he couldn't name but could feel missing. Over the following weeks, Curtis learned to walk again. It was harder than he'd expected. Not the physical mechanics, though those were challenging, but the psychological adjustment. Every step was conscious, deliberate, a reminder that his body had been fundamentally altered. The phantom pain was worse than the actual amputation. His brain insisting that his missing foot still existed, still hurt, creating agony from nerve endings that weren't there anymore. Other wounded men surrounded him at Walter Reed, men with missing arms, missing legs, missing faces, men who'd been burned or shattered or blinded. The ward was full of bodies that had been broken by the machinery of war and were now being slowly, painfully reassembled into something approximating wholeness. Curtis made friends with a tank commander named Williams who'd lost both legs when his Sherman took a hit from an 88mm gun. Williams was from Alabama, spoke with a drawl that made everything sound philosophical, and had a dark sense of humor about their shared situation. "You know what's funny?" Williams said one evening as they practiced walking in the rehabilitation room. "I spent 3 years terrified of dying. Never occurred to me to be scared of surviving." Curtis understood exactly what he meant. Death in combat seemed almost merciful compared to this, the long, uncertain process of figuring out how to exist in a world that expected you to be whole when you fundamentally weren't. Letters arrived from home. His mother wrote every week, carefully cheerful missives that never quite acknowledged the reality of Curtis's injury. His father's letters were more direct, discussing practical matters, asking about medical care, offering advice about adjusting to civilian life. Neither parent mentioned the obvious question, what would Curtis do now? He didn't have an answer. In March, Curtis received official notification that he'd been awarded the Legion of Merit. The citation was formal, bureaucratic, for exceptionally meritorious conduct in the performance of outstanding services. Sergeant Culin's invention of the hedgerow cutting device demonstrated extraordinary ingenuity and initiative, directly contributing to the success of Operation Cobra and the subsequent Allied advance across France. The medal arrived in a small box. Curtis opened it, stared at the bronze cross and ribbon, and felt nothing. The Legion of Merit was one of the Army's highest decorations, awarded for achievement that fell just short of heroism. It meant his contribution had been recognized, valued, deemed worthy of official honor. But the medal couldn't give him his leg back, couldn't erase the memories of men dying in the Bocage and the Hürtgen, couldn't answer the fundamental question of what Curtis Culin was supposed to do with the rest of his life. A reporter from the Army newspaper came to interview him, a young lieutenant with a notebook and an earnest expression assigned to write a human interest story about the man behind the hedgerow cutter. "How did you come up with the idea?" the lieutenant asked. Curtis had answered this question before, would answer it many more times. "A soldier named Roberts suggested it. I just worked out the engineering." "But it was your design, your calculations." "Roberts had the insight. I had the training. Neither one alone would have been enough." The lieutenant wrote that down, though Curtis suspected the final article would minimize Roberts's contribution. That's how these stories worked. They needed heroes, singular figures, who could be celebrated and photographed and turned into symbols. Shared credit made for complicated narratives. "Do you feel like a hero?" the lieutenant asked. Curtis thought about it honestly. "I feel like a sergeant who got lucky. Thousands of burial men did more important things and got nothing but a grave registration number. That's not what General Bradley says. He calls your invention one of the key factors in winning the Battle of Normandy." Bradley. Curtis remembered the general's intensity, his focus, the way he'd committed the entire Army's ordnance capacity to mass-producing an untested device designed by a sergeant with a notebook. Bradley had gambled on Curtis's idea, and the gamble had paid off. "General Bradley is generous," Curtis said diplomatically. The article appeared in Stars and Stripes a week later. It portrayed Curtis as a humble hero, emphasizing his self-effacement and his insistence on sharing credit with Roberts. The article was well written, accurate in its facts, and somehow completely wrong in its tone. It made Curtis sound noble when he just felt tired. More reporters followed. The hedgerow cutter had become famous. A feel-good story about American ingenuity overcoming German defenses. Curtis gave interviews, repeated the same anecdotes, and watched as his contribution was slowly transformed from practical engineering into patriotic mythology. In April, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Men who'd been fighting for years were suddenly confronted with peace, and many didn't know what to do with it. Curtis was among them. He was medically discharged from the Army in May 1945. The paperwork was straightforward. Honorable discharge, disability pension, veterans benefits. Sergeant Curtis G. Culin III was officially a civilian again, free to return to the life that the Depression and the war had interrupted, except that life didn't exist anymore. The man who'd left Cranford in 1941 was gone, replaced by someone Curtis didn't quite recognize. New York City, June 1945. Curtis took an apartment in Greenwich Village. The neighborhood was bohemian, artistic, full of writers and painters, and people who seemed comfortable with not fitting into conventional society. Curtis didn't feel bohemian or artistic, but he appreciated the anonymity. In the village, a man with a limp and a prosthetic leg was just another damaged veteran trying to figure out civilian life. His father had arranged a job interview at Schenley Industries, the same company where Curtis had worked before the war, trimming windows and computing costs. The position was different now. Salesman leveraging his war record and his Legion of Merit to help Schenley sell liquor to bars and restaurants across New York. "You're a war hero," the hiring manager explained. "That means something to people. They'll buy from you because of what you represent." Curtis wanted to argue that he wasn't a hero, just a sergeant who'd gotten lucky with a notebook sketch, but he needed the job. The disability pension helped, but it wasn't enough to live on, so he accepted the position and tried to figure out how to sell bourbon to people who probably needed it to forget the same things Curtis was trying to forget. The work was soul-crushing in a way that combat hadn't been. At least in the war, Curtis's actions mattered. Men lived or died based on whether the hedgerow cutters worked, whether the scouts found the minefields, whether the intelligence reports were accurate. But selling liquor? That was just commerce, meaningless transactions that enriched Schenley while contributing nothing of value to the world. Curtis walked the streets of Manhattan, limped really, though he was getting better with the prosthetic, and watched a city that had moved on from the war. The celebrations of VE Day were fading, rationing was ending. People were returning to normal life, or trying to, as if the past 4 years could be filed away like old paperwork. But Curtis couldn't move on. At night he dreamed about the bocage, dreamed about hedgerows exploding as Sherman tanks punched through them, dreamed about the Hürtgen Forest and the moment when his boot found the mine, dreamed about Kowalski and Morrison and all the others who hadn't made it home. He started drinking, not heavily. Curtis had seen too many men destroy themselves with alcohol, but enough to dull the edges, to make sleep possible, to get through days that seemed to have no purpose beyond waiting for tomorrow. In August, Curtis received an invitation to a ceremony. General Bradley would be in New York, and he wanted to personally present Curtis with his Legion of Merit. The ceremony would be at City Hall, with press coverage and speeches and all the pageantry that went with celebrating wartime achievements in peacetime. Curtis almost didn't go. The idea of standing in front of cameras while Bradley pinned a medal on his chest felt performative, hollow. But refusing would have been insulting, and Curtis respected Bradley too much for that. The ceremony was exactly what Curtis expected, formal, scripted, designed to create photographs that would appear in newspapers across the country. Bradley gave a short speech about ingenuity and initiative, about how one sergeant's idea had changed the course of the campaign. Curtis stood at attention, accepting the medal, smiling for the cameras, playing the role of humble hero. Afterward, Bradley pulled him aside. "How are you managing, Culin?" "Fine, sir." Bradley studied him with the same intensity Curtis remembered from Normandy. "That's a lie. Don't waste lies on me." Curtis felt something in his chest loosen slightly. "It's an adjustment, sir. Civilian life. The leg. Trying to figure out what I'm supposed to do now." "You're supposed to live," Bradley said simply. "That's what the men who didn't make it home would want. Not survival. Living. There's a difference." Curtis nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "The hedgerow cutter saved thousands of lives," Bradley continued. "Those men went home to families, had children, built careers. Your contribution ripples forward in ways you'll never see. That matters, Culin. Don't forget it matters." It was the most honest conversation Curtis had with anyone about his war experience. Bradley understood in ways that civilians couldn't, understood that survival came with costs that couldn't be calculated, that heroism looked different from the inside, that the men who made it home carried burdens that never showed up in newspaper articles. In October, Curtis met Bernice Enright at a party in the village. She was 23, worked as a secretary, and had a directness that Curtis found refreshing after months of people treating him like fragile china. They talked about art and music and books, safe topics that had nothing to do with war. Bernice noticed his limp but didn't mention it, which Curtis appreciated more than sympathy. They started dating. Carefully at first, Curtis uncertain whether he had anything to offer a woman beyond damage and memories. But Bernice saw something in him worth pursuing, some core of the man Curtis had been before the Depression and the war had shaped him into something harder. "You're allowed to be happy," Bernice told him one evening, "so I know you don't think you are, but you're allowed." Curtis wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that the war hadn't permanently broken something essential inside him. But happiness seemed like a luxury reserved for people who hadn't watched friends burn alive in tanks or step on mines that erased their futures. Still he tried, because Bernice was right. The men who died would have wanted him to try. They married in June 1946, in a small ceremony in Cranford. Curtis's parents were there, proud and relieved to see their son building something resembling a normal life. A few Army friends attended, veterans who understood without needing explanations. Private Roberts sent a telegram from Tennessee. "Congratulations. You still owe me drinks in Paris?" Curtis smiled when he read it. Roberts was one of the few people who could joke about the war without it feeling like he was diminishing what had happened. Maybe because Roberts had been there, had seen the same things, had earned the right to laugh at nightmares they both shared. The marriage was good, not perfect. Curtis's nightmares sometimes woke Bernice, and his moods could darken without warning, but good. Bernice worked at maintaining it, creating a home that felt safe, encouraging Curtis to talk about things he'd rather forget. She understood that healing wasn't linear, that some wounds never fully closed. Curtis continued working for Shenley, selling liquor throughout New York and New Jersey. He was good at the job, which depressed him. The war had taught him practical problem solving, how to read people, how to persist through obstacles. Those skills translated surprisingly well to sales, even if the work felt meaningless compared to engineering devices that saved lives. But meaning was a luxury. Bills needed paying, life required income. So Curtis sold bourbon and tried not to think about how he'd gone from solving tactical problems in combat to convincing bartenders to stock Shenley products. In 1947, Curtis received a letter from the Army. They were compiling official histories of the war, and they wanted detailed information about the hedgerow cutter's development. Curtis spent several evenings writing out the timeline, Roberts' suggestion, the midnight sketches, the prototype demonstration, and the mass production effort, Operation Cobra's success. He emphasized Roberts' contribution repeatedly, knowing the official history would probably minimize it anyway. That's how these things worked. Complex stories got simplified, shared credit got redistributed, and eventually someone decided who the heroes were based on factors that had nothing to do with what actually happened. The final history, published in 1949, credited Curtis as the inventor of the hedgerow cutter, with a footnote mentioning Roberts' helpful suggestion. Curtis wrote to Roberts, apologizing for how the story had been told. Roberts wrote back, "Don't worry about it. I know what happened. You know what happened. That's enough." It wasn't enough, but Curtis appreciated the sentiment. The years passed with the strange acceleration of peacetime. Curtis and Bernice moved to a larger apartment. Curtis was promoted at Shenley, given more responsibility, earning enough to live comfortably, if not extravagantly. They talked about having children, but never quite got around to it. Curtis, uncertain whether he wanted to bring children into a world that had so recently torn itself apart. The war gradually receded from public consciousness. New crises emerged: the Soviet threat, the Korean War, political scandals, and economic anxieties that pushed 1944 into history. Curtis's Legion of Merit sat in a drawer. His prosthetic leg became so familiar he sometimes forgot it wasn't original equipment, but he never forgot the bocage, never forgot the faces of men who died because tanks couldn't cross hedgerows, never forgot the weight of responsibility when hundreds of welders worked around the clock to mass-produce a device Curtis had sketched in a notebook. In 1953, Curtis and Bernice divorced. It was amicable, as such things go, no dramatic conflict, just a slow recognition that they'd built their marriage on hope that Curtis could become someone he wasn't. Bernice remarried within a year. Curtis remained alone, which felt appropriate somehow. The 1950s blurred together. Curtis continued selling liquor, attended Veterans Day ceremonies when invited, occasionally gave talks at high schools about the war, sanitizing the stories for audiences who wanted inspiration rather than truth. He told them about ingenuity and initiative, about how American soldiers solve problems through practical thinking. He didn't tell them about the smell of burned flesh or the sound of men screaming in German minefields. In January 1961, Curtis attended a ceremony in Washington, D.C. President Eisenhower, 5 days before leaving office, was giving his farewell address to the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. Curtis was invited because Eisenhower planned to mention the hedgerow cutter as an example of battlefield innovation. Curtis sat in the audience, anonymous among hundreds, and listened as the president spoke. "There was a little sergeant," Eisenhower said. "His name was Culin, and he had an idea. And his idea was that we could fasten knives, great big steel knives, in front of these tanks, and as they came along, they would cut off these banks right at ground level. They would go through on the level keel, would carry with themselves a little bit of camouflage for a while. And this idea was brought to the captain, to the major, to the colonel, and it got high enough that somebody did something about it, and that was General Bradley. And he did it very quickly." Eisenhower paused. "Now, the biggest and happiest group, I suppose, in all the Allied armies that night were those that knew that this thing worked." Curtis felt something shift in his chest. Eisenhower had been supreme commander, responsible for millions of men carrying burdens Curtis couldn't imagine. And yet he remembered a sergeant's invention, remembered its importance, thought it worthy of mentioning in his final address as president. Maybe it had mattered after all. Maybe Curtis's contribution had been more than just a momentary solution to a tactical problem. Maybe, though Curtis struggled to believe it, he'd actually changed something significant. After the ceremony, several people recognized Curtis and wanted to shake his hand. He accepted their congratulations with the same self-effacing courtesy he'd maintained for 16 years. But inside, something had shifted. Not healing exactly. Some wounds didn't heal, but recognition. Acknowledgement that the scared, exhausted sergeant who'd sketched a device in a muddy foxhole had accomplished something worth remembering. Curtis continued his life in New York, continued selling liquor, continued living alone in Greenwich Village, continued managing the phantom pain in his missing leg. He stayed in touch with a few Army friends, attended occasional reunions, maintained connections to a past that defined him even as he tried to move beyond it. In November 1963, Curtis Culin died in his apartment in Greenwich Village. He was 48 years old. The death certificate listed heart failure, which was true but incomplete. Curtis had been dying slowly since the Hürtgen Forest, not from his physical wounds, which had healed as well as could be expected, but from the weight of surviving when so many others hadn't. His obituary appeared in the New York Times. 3 paragraphs about the sergeant who invented the hedgerow cutter, changed the course of the Battle of Normandy, and then disappeared into civilian obscurity. The obituary mentioned his Legion of Merit, his work for Shenley Industries, his death in Greenwich Village. It didn't mention the nightmares, didn't mention the phantom pain or the survivor's guilt or the way Curtis sometimes woke up convinced he was still in the bocage, hearing German machine guns and watching tanks burn. Those parts didn't fit the narrative of the humble hero who'd saved lives through ingenuity, but they were real. All of it was real. Curtis was buried with military honors at a cemetery in New Jersey. A small ceremony attended by family, a few Army friends, and some Shenley colleagues who'd known him as a quiet, competent salesman who never talked about the war. The honor guard fired a salute. A bugler played taps. The American flag was folded and presented to Curtis's father, who'd outlived his only son. Private Roberts attended, traveling from Tennessee. He stood at the graveside after everyone else had left, looking at the headstone that listed Curtis's name, dates, and rank. "You did good, Sergeant," Roberts said quietly to the ground. "Better than you knew, better than you believed." A marker was later placed in Cranford, New Jersey, Curtis's hometown, commemorating his contribution. It quoted Eisenhower's speech, turning Curtis into a symbol of American ingenuity and determination. School children would pass it on their way to classes, most of them never knowing who Curtis Culin had been or what his invention had accomplished. But the hedgerow cutter remained. Every military historian who studied the Battle of Normandy mentioned it. Every account of Operation Cobra explained how Rhino tanks had broken through defenses that had stalled the Allied advance. The device Curtis had sketched in a notebook became standard equipment for studying how tactical problems get solved under pressure. Years later, a maintenance facility at Fort Knox was named after Curtis. The Culin Memorial Building, dedicated to training mechanics and engineers in practical problem solving. It was exactly the kind of honor Curtis would have appreciated, not ceremonial, but functional, serving an actual purpose. And in some alternate version of history that Curtis never got to see, his invention rippled forward. The men who survived Operation Cobra because tanks could finally punch through hedgerows went home. They had children. Those children had children. Families that existed because Curtis Culin had the engineering knowledge to turn a drunk soldier's joke into a working solution. Thousands of lives saved, tens of thousands of descendants who never knew they owed their existence to a sergeant with a notebook and access to German beach obstacles. That was Curtis's legacy. Invisible, uncelebrated, but absolutely real. He'd been a clerk from Cranford who'd survived the Depression by improvising, a reluctant soldier who'd found purpose in solving problems that got men killed, a wounded veteran who'd struggled to find meaning in a peacetime that felt hollow after everything he'd experienced. He'd never thought of himself as a hero, never quite believed that his contribution mattered compared to the sacrifices of men who died in combat. Never fully escaped the shadow of the war that had defined and damaged him. But he'd been wrong. It did matter. He did make a difference. And maybe, Though Curtis Culin died without believing it, that was enough. In every war machine, there's a human story. Curtis Culin's story was about fear and brilliance and survival, about the Depression-era clerk who became the sergeant who changed the course of a campaign, about the cost of innovation and the price of coming home. History remembered the invention, but the man behind it, scarred and struggling and ultimately broken by what he'd survived, remained mostly forgotten. That seemed right to Curtis, who never wanted recognition in the first place. He just wanted to save lives, and in that, at least, he'd succeeded beyond measure.